Okay, guys, thanks for joining us again. This is the third episode of Help I'm a Camera Nerd now. So thanks for coming back. This episode, we're going to be talking about mainly the Red Komodo, because that's the camera that I own and use at the minute. But we're going to be going over Red as a brand. We're going to be going into whether or not it's worth paying the kind of money that Red charge for their cameras and whether that benefits you when you get out there and you start working. So Anderson, you got some questions you're going to throw my way? Take it away.
Yeah, so why did you go back? Obviously, last episode we talked about, our your love for Blackmagic, and then you convincing me to love it, which, I didn't need much convincing. And obviously you've gone back to Red. Why go back? What did you find in the 6 or 7 years that you have with Blackmagic? Well, what didn't you find that the Red did have? That Red as a brand, I should say, has.
Okay. So I went back because I'd moved to a smaller camera. I'd moved to the Pocket. So I didn't have the big Ursa Mini. And, when you're going on to bigger shoots, you kind of need a camera that's a bit more flexible. The Pocket's locked into EF mount lenses, so you can't use cinema lenses. So if we, shot a few films in anamorphic and, it wasn't really something we could consider using the Pocket, although we did use it as a B camera on some of the shoots. But yeah, it's not really a camera you can rig out quite as much. You want to be monitoring and stuff. It doesn't have SDI out, so it's difficult to get like that full cinema setup on a Pocket. It probably can be done, but it's a lot more difficult than using, and it's also not Netflix approved. And how people are when they want cameras, even though you're making a short, it's not going on Netflix. You still kind of want to adhere to those rules in some way. I guess it makes you feel like you're doing things properly. So yeah, well, my big choice for going back to a Komodo was my big reason was I wanted something that I could use on bigger shoots. And yeah, Red, and Blackmagic as a brand name is not the most sought after camera, should I say. It's not like people are out there really looking for Blackmagic camera owners as much as they are specifically requesting a Red camera or a Sony camera or an Arri. So you do find that more and more jobs over the past few years have been specifying the camera that they want you to have. And, the Pocket, unfortunately, isn't a beefy enough camera for people to be recommending very often. Whereas Red as a brand name has a bit more oomph to it. It's got a bit more of a name. I always remember I was talking to one of my family members and I mentioned Red, and they knew what a Red camera was. And I found that fascinating because they had no interest in like cameras or anything like that. But, people outside of the industry know what a Red is. People outside of the industry don't necessarily know what Blackmagic is, even though they should. But, we're not talking necessarily about how it should be. It's just how it is, unfortunately, right now. And that, that could change. But yeah, Red right now is just, and has been for, the past 10 years longer. It's been a big name in the film industry. It's been right up there with Arri. I wouldn't say it's necessarily... Would I say it's on par with Arri? What do you think? Some DOPs are going to they'll go towards Red over Arri, right?
Yeah, I think obviously in this country it's a bit different. I think in the UK, it definitely
Are you checking a message during our podcast?
Sorry, I just got like an alert to say something's on the front doorbell, and I just have to check on that. No, I think.
Oh, it's a doorbell alert.
Yeah. Google's taking over my life. I think the thing that's just really interesting about whether it's Red or Arri. I mean, most of the films that we love in the last 10 years, or the Oscar-winning films or whatever, have been shot on an Arri Alexa, right? They do the, there's like always the list of what's showing, what was shot on the cameras that went to Sundance or whatever. And it's always Arri Alexa, Arri Classics at the top. And you'll see some Red, some Sonys, and, occasionally a Blackmagic. But I think, you know, for me, I'd say at the beginning of my career, because I'd say, you know, I definitely thought that red, you know, was a standard, and I still think it is. I think it is alternative to the standard, right? It's a 1B or 2, or it's the B plus to the ARRI's A plus. But you have to think about why ARRI is the standard, and obviously the British film industry is more traditional. They like things that work closer to how film would work, and there was some pushback at the red at first, but and I think red had a period before the Alexa came out where it was the one that was accepted. But once the Alexa came out and it was just, the workflow is so much easier. It's very much like the film cameras you're used to using, the Super 35 or Super 16 or 16 mil cameras, Super 16 cameras that they're used to using. And it to be honest, it really is. I think then that's when people went to the one side with red. But for me, I think, look, the image looks great. It's, you know, if it's good enough for a David Fincher or Michael flipping Bay, then yeah, why would I think I'd turn my nose up at that? So, hey, from the outside looking in, you know, if someone gave me the choice, look, you know, hey, either is a great option, but I know that this British industry is a little bit more, I don't want to say snobbish, but it's a bit more traditional. They like things staying the way as it was, you know. That's what I'd say.
I mean, let's just as well, like, talk about red as a brand, because you mentioned like Michael Bay and David Fincher, and you know what red does, what no one else does, is they will build custom cameras for their big directors. And David Fincher had like that big camera, that red camera specifically built for him for Mindhunter, right?
Yeah.
Just to shoot that on. So no other camera brand is really customizing their cameras for, and it's almost like, you know, it's the equivalent in the camera industry of having like a Gucci handbag almost, right? It's like, it's impressive. Like camera nerds like me and you, we see those cameras and we're like, oh wow, look at that. That's a custom red. It looks completely different. It's interesting and it's good for the brand because it attracts those directors in. I mean, I know directors that are probably going to pick resolution and like, you know, future proofing and stuff like that over the Alexa, for instance, that, you know, before the Alexa 35 came out, does that shoot just 4K or does it do?
It's 4.6K.
So, I mean, red is like shooting 8K and stuff like that. So it's going to give you more flexibility in post, right, to manipulate the image and do stuff over that, like over Alexa, which is going to pretty much, you're going to be stuck in at how you frame something up. I mean, you can slightly crop the image and stuff, but, you know, certain directors, cinematographers are just going to go for the resolution. It's not necessarily going to be about the camera as much. It's about future proofing, or if that's going to be beneficial in post in some way because they're cropping, stabilizing, like Kingsman, you know, like the famous Kingsman fight scene. There would have been a lot of cropping in that, a lot of like stabilizing the footage. I'd imagine you'd go for a red, right? In that scenario, you're going to go for something with higher resolution.
I'd say so. I mean,
probably.
Yeah. I mean, I jump in there because it's interesting because ARRI's pushback to that has always been, it's not about the amount of pixels, it's the quality of them, right? And the one thing I'll say about the Alexa it still is the industry standard for dynamic range, color depth, and I still, it holds up. Like even the Alexa Classic, that 1080p, it's very different to a 1080p out of even a Sony F5 or an F55 or whatever. There is a sharpness to it, even though the resolution itself isn't as high, right? But obviously, when you look at 4K and then you downsample, so for people who don't know what downsampling, it's basically you're squashing an image down, or you're squashing the sides of an image down from say 4K to 1080p, but you're not losing your field of view. So you have, for the 1 pixel you had, you now have 2 or 2.5 or pixels fitting in that 1 pixel. So your image is a bit sharper. It increases the color depth to it. So you do have those. I think if it's about future proofing, of course you can always go with higher resolution. But even saying that, if a film looks great, people will make an exception regardless, right? So it's, but in the experience that we've had, and we talked about it last week with Falling and my film Rest that I shot in around 2012, the image still looks really good. You know, you could, you know, cut that in a show reel and you think that's from, you know, 2017, 18, 20, no problem. Because it's, you know, and that you had the resolution at that point, it was the only camera doing 4K at that point, or that, you know, most people could afford, or some people in the industry could afford. So I think it's still about the choice. But the Alexa image, you know, we all try and make our cameras look like that for a reason, right?
Yeah, and I mean, you know, even if I had my choice over cameras, I would probably pick the Alexa Mini, just because I like the camera, I like how easy it is to use, I like the image coming out of it. But that camera obviously costs £35,000, and you know, that's just not something that I could afford to buy. Whereas a Komodo, Blackmagic, whatever, they are, you know, around the $5,000 Komodo is. So but it is competing with those cameras, you know, and like, I'll always say it's more about what you do as a DP, production designer, all of that comes before the technical stuff. In my opinion, when you're filmmaking, you know, that all comes first and then the technical stuff comes after. So yeah, I mean, even down to your lens choice is going to change the image. You're not going to get one specific look continuously. Like, your lenses are going to make a difference in everything. So that's always something to consider. And I mean, cameras today are so good that, you know, to the point, like we've said previously, you can be shooting stuff on your iPhone and it looks great. So it's coming down to personal preference now. I guess it's coming down to how you work in post-production, what you like to color, how you like the image to look, over necessarily technical things holding you back in this day and age.
I'd say, you know, let me jump in there, because obviously you mentioned, obviously the Red Komodo, and obviously we're talking about it, Andy. That's what I mean. But, you know, there is a number of options now, and there is more, you know, compared to 2012, there wasn't a lot of high quality Super 35 options, whereas now there's a plethora of them. You know, there's other cameras that, you know, are getting a lot of buzz. You got the Sony FX6, which is Sony's latest small camcorder, professional camcorder. And then you have the Canon C70. You know, when you look at them on paper, you know, obviously you compare full frame to Super 35 with the FX6 versus the Komodo. But with the Canon C70, similar kind of specs. Some would say there's some things that are a little bit more flexible, like internal and neutral density filters. Why did you choose the Red Scarlet instead of those two cameras? Canon's a big name. Sony, we know that it's really, it's super in demand right now. But why the Red Komodo over those cameras?
So I didn't even actually consider Canon. I briefly looked at them a little bit, but I've been away from Canon now for so long that I'm not a big fan of I'm just not a big fan of the cameras anymore, really. That's the thing. So Canon was never really going to be on my radar, but the FX6 was on my radar. And, you know, that offers some things that are definitely compelling. I went for what I considered to be a cinema camera. And I'm not saying the FX6 isn't a cinema camera, but the Red is. It feels like that's the first and foremost. I mean, it was obviously a crash cam first, but it feels like Red as a brand name, and I'm buying into the brand name here. Red has just got some push in the industry, you know. They're not changing cameras every year. They're not bringing out new cameras often. Saying that, they did just announce a new Komodo. Yeah, they did. But they're not doing it as often. Yeah. So I wasn't really looking for Sony. I have EF lenses. I just wanted to go back to Red. I think when I left Red, it was because the camera just wasn't fit for what I needed. And Red have, you know, changed a lot of the stuff now. You've got ProRes built in. You've got really nice features. I really love the, they've got like a false color system where you can assign a color to each stop. 16 stops of dynamic range. So it's essentially creating your own false color and assigning whatever color you want to that stop. So I love that feature. I'm a big fan of false color. I'm always for like using two things to expose. So I'm always using my waveform and false color. They're like my go-to for making sure I've got the best exposure I can. They've got I feel like they're way more giving now. I talked to you the other day about they've got autofocus. It's in beta, but it's decent. I know the Sony does, but they're just being way more open now to you using that camera in many different environments rather than it just being a cinema camera. I also noticed, I was on shoot the other day, it's just not burning through batteries even remotely close to like the Scarlet that I had previously. Like I'm getting through a day on 2 batteries, and it's like, and that's powering the monitor and the camera, and that's decent. Like, you know, I'm not having to worry about turning the camera off or like, you know, turning the monitor off to try and save battery. And that's a big thing, you know, like batteries on shoot. You don't want to constantly be turning the camera off and on, and you don't want to have to be bringing 50 batteries with you and constantly worrying about cycling charges and stuff, because you don't always have someone there to help you with that kind of stuff, and you don't always have power outlets available. So yeah, the camera's small. The one thing I liked about the Komodo that was quite an attractive prospect, and maybe you can fit the FX6 onto a gimbal, but that red will sit on my RS3 Pro with no problem. I can balance it on there. And that's a big pull for me. Like, you know, it's flexible. It basically becomes a Steadicam as soon as you put it on like the tilt to float, and that's like a big deal to be able to have that gimbal there, because the learning curve for a Steadicam is a lot bigger than the learning curve for a gimbal.
Yeah.
And the learning curve for a tilt to float. So it's like, you know, we're getting AI tools now that are built into these products to help us achieve cinematic shots without spending months learning on a Steadicam that you might, you know, not have access to. And also Steadicam's like what, 5-6 grand for a decent one. You can get cheaper ones, but you know, the kind of industry standard ones,
even more than
they're
that.
not cheap.
Even more than that.
And where are you going to get one of those? Yeah, to practice on. So it's like a gimbal Ronin. That's what, $1 grand for the full spec'd out Ronin RS3 Pro. I mean, it's that accessibility that's just for people, that's giving them tools, that are giving them the opportunity to get better footage. And I bought into the RS3 Pro, so I didn't want to sell my Pocket and then get a camera that I couldn't really use on that, because I'd spent money. I've got the, you know, all the bits and bobs that come with it, the Raven Eye, the LiDAR sensor and stuff. So I wanted something that was going to still be flexible, and I wanted a camera that I could work with the majority of kit that I already had. And part of me feels like if you go Sony, you probably want to go Sony lenses, but then that locks you into the Sony system, and I don't want to be selling all my lenses, you know, and then rebuying, and then if I sell my camera, you know, 2 years down the line, 3 years down the line, I'm having to sell all my lenses as well. So for me it was about getting something that could just sit in with the stuff I had, minimum amount of change.
You know, another question I wanted you to bring up, or you know, the topic we're going to bring up. Just talk about the lens mount. Obviously, you know, a lens mount, you know, there's so many different options. Obviously, EF lenses are the good quality lenses for the cost, but they're more often than not, they're stills lenses. I know there's more cinema EF lenses than ever before, but it's not, that mount was never built to do that. You always need to be a PA mount because it's part of your duty. You can have heavier lenses with those mounts. But the Komodo has a new type of mount. And you talked about that flexibility, how red is more open. What does that new mount allow you to do? Show me some of the flexibility that it allows for.
So I guess like the issue with a lot of cameras is obviously, you know, the lens mount is locking you into a system, and certain lens mounts will lock you into certain systems. And it's all to do with the distance between, you know, the sensor and the lens, right? So the industry standard is PL mount lenses. The majority of cinema lenses are PL mount lenses. So if you go to a kit house and you want to rent lenses, you need a PL to have the maximum amount of choice. They will rent you other lenses, but PL is going to give you the maximum range of different lenses you can pick. So the RF mount, which is Canon's new mount, is basically, because it's so close to the sensor, right? So it gives you that flexibility to switch it out and put other lens mounts on there. Yeah. So it comes with that lens mount, but they also, in the package, give you an EF lens mount for free. So they obviously expect their users to be using EF lenses on the camera. So, but then also I can put a PL mount lens on it, because I can just get a PL adapter, and that's an adapter that fits into the current lens mount. So I'm not unscrewing lens mounts like you used to on the Scarlet, which would then have an impact on your back focus. And, you know, you go down a minefield of trying to sort your own back focus, and it can just get horribly wrong, which is going to mess up your focal distances on the lens. It's going to create a hassle for the focus puller and so on. So having it all within flexible lens mounts means that you don't have to worry about that, because it's kind of thought about for you. So I have the EF lens mount, which I bought the extra one that comes with NDs built in, which is super handy on shoots, because it means that you're not having to have a matte box or screw on lens filters. It's just a variable ND lens filter built in, which you can pull out and swap out for other filters, which is a nice touch. And then if I want to switch to PL, I just need to buy the PL mount. Now, Red obviously offer a PL mount, but it's incredibly expensive. But the great thing is now that other companies are offering lens mounts, and they're approved by Red, and it's fine, and they're cheaper options. So, you know, that it's as easy as me maybe being on shoot and going, oh, we've got the PL lenses, but, you know, we don't really have a wide one, or we need something like a bit fisheye. We'll just swap that lens mount over. Takes 2 seconds, stick this EF lens, and it's like no trouble. It's super handy. It's super accessible for you to do that. And that is a big draw for me. Like, you know, changeable lens mounts with minimal effort. I think it's the first lens mount, right, that you get just a mount that can clip into like a PL mount that can just go onto that lens mount.
Yeah, so you have the E mount as well, the Sony E mount, because that's some of the flexibility on that. I was on a shoot with a DP the other day. Stephen Melling, great guy, great eye for lighting, and took care of me. Thank you, Stephen. And what I found fascinating was we would go between PL lenses and E mount lenses. So it would literally, and he would leave the mount for the for the PL lenses on one of the PL lenses he had, so you could constantly go back to it. I found that was really fascinating to do that. So I think, you know, more of the newer lens manufacturers or the camera manufacturers are going with that open source kind of feel. I know it's not open source as in everyone can adapt to it, but just in terms of having the flexibility to adapt other type of mounts onto your camera mount. I think it's it's a really great feature to have. But obviously we talked about that, and it's interesting, but there's a big elephant in the room, and that's RAW. Why is RAW so important? Why did you want to stay in that? Because, you know, obviously brand name is there, but, you know, the FX6 is being used a lot on jobs. You know, the commercial I just talked about, we shot an FX6. Yeah. But what talk about that RAW and how that's such a key part of your workflow.
Yeah, I mean, you know, when I switched over from my Scarlet, which had only RAW, and I switched over to the Blackmagic, and I kind of went to ProRes because that's what I was using at the time. I was in film school, we were shooting on Alexa. ProRes 422HQ was the standard. And, you know, we didn't really need anything higher than that unless you were going to be doing like chroma key and green screen type of stuff, and then you could go to 444. When I wanted a camera that could do RAW, because I also grade like the footage, and the flexibility that you get with RAW when you go into post-production, you know, changing the ISO, the color balance, all of those settings that you can change, the pipeline, the log that you're using. You don't necessarily always need it, but it's a really nice thing to have. And it's a really, like, just a workflow you kind of get used to. And I think when Blackmagic brought out Blackmagic Raw, that got me back into using Raw again, because, you know, you could select a setting that you weren't really getting, you weren't recording that much more data than ProRes 422HQ. It was almost on par with it. And it kind of still is, even the RAW in the red. It's, you know, they've just brought out a new RAW setting that actually gives you more space than shooting, and that's shooting 6K in RAW than shooting 4K in ProRes 422HQ. And it is a low quality, but for some things, like, that's going to be more than enough. And I guess it's kind of like, it's just, with the Sonys, I'm less familiar. You know, you're more familiar because obviously through work, you use the codecs for like the F5 and stuff. But for me, it would have been, I guess, a new learning curve. And I've used the Venice, and obviously that is a big cinema camera. And we had issues even just getting the footage off that camera because the files were so large, and playing them back was like almost, I mean, it was an old Mac, but it was, you know, it's difficult. Whereas, you know, you can play back Komodo footage on a laptop, and it's not necessarily the best scenario, but it's still an option. You know, you can back that footage up. You know, it's not going to take ages. And it's the flexibility to go from ProRes, which is an industry standard, to RAW. It's giving me the two things that I want. I'm always going to want ProRes, because when it comes to clients and giving them footage, you do not want your client to have to download a million unknown applications, and ProRes is just something they can put on their laptop, click the space bar, and it's going to play. It's a QuickTime file. It's not going to need anything extra.
Yeah, because it's made by Apple. Yeah.
So ProRes is a big deal for me. It's almost as big a deal as RAW, because when it comes to client workflow, it's just something that works. And yeah, you know, Sony, I'm sure, would be fine, but ProRes is just simple. It's a really, you just get used to it. You see why people use it, and it's something I'm not quite ready to give up yet. So that's definitely a factor when I was thinking about where to go next. I wanted that flexibility of having the RAW, but also keeping the ProRes as well.
You know, I think it's, I mean, there's a lot of interesting points there with that, because I think ProRes has been around since 2010, you know, and Apple made that codec, and it was just Apple ProRes at the time. There wasn't a high quality, low quality, or 444. It was just Apple ProRes 422. Someone correct me if I'm wrong. Email me. But that was.
I think actually, you know, I think it was out before that. At uni, they brought out the different versions of ProRes. Yes, I remember, because the 444 came out.
Yeah.
And a few, I guess the other ones. And I remember that being a big deal. Yeah. And that was like, I think it was like a Final Cut thing, maybe. I can't quite remember. But I remember when those codecs came out for Final Cut, and it was like, oh, that one like has super quality. Like you can, that one's getting all, like 4444, that's getting all the quality right there. So I think it came out around 2010. The extra ones. I'm not sure how long it was out before.
I think it might have been a Final Cut Pro 7 thing. So I'll have to look that up and clarify that for the next episode. But obviously the whole point of it was that you didn't have to render it when you put it in Final Cut Pro 7. You didn't have to render it when you made one slight change. It just played, because, you know, this is new. Obviously, this sounds crazy now, but before, you know, guys, this is back in 20, you know, the late noughts. If you made one change in your timeline, you added a cut, you know, added a template, to play it back, you had to render it first. You had to render. It was only when things started going to 64-bit with Premiere, and Premiere did this first, that you could just whack pretty much any footage in, and it would create the peak files in the background, but then you would be able to play it, you know, you play it back without needing to render. It might be choppy, but it played back. That's where the big move from Final Cut to Premiere happened, because you didn't need to render everything before you used it. But yeah, I think that raw and just to go into details for the guys who aren't familiar with raw, with raw photos, you can change the color, the color temperature, the ISO, as in the sensitivity of the sensor after you do it. So it creates it so that by doing that, it raises your exposure up and down, and it doesn't make it as grainy as it would do if it was a compressed format like a JPEG when we talk about stills. So you're able to change the color, the brightness, so much of your image without it starting to go grainy because there's a loss of that image quality because it's compressed. Now, Red took that philosophy and put it into a video format. So 25 frames, each frame is a raw frame. So you could change your ISO, which increases your brightness, and change your exposure, change the color temperature. So if you shoot it wrong, you could just come back to, if you shoot it the wrong color, it's, oh no, the footage looks a bit blue. Oh, it's fine. Change the slider, without it really degrading the quality of image, because it's what we call, it's a 16-bit codec. Whereas some of the mirrorless cameras, they only shoot 8-bit. I think now they're starting to have 10-bit codecs. Apple ProRes, the format is only 10-bit. So obviously, and the more bits, guys, the better it is, the more quality and the more data there is, obviously. So it allowed that flexibility, which is why we're saying when we talk about future proofing, it's not just about it being 4K. It's we can completely regrade the films we shot 8, 9, 10 years ago. Now update the look profile of the footage, because Red might have said, oh, you know what, we realized we could do a gamma curve or the look for the footage in a better way and process it in a better way now than we could 5 years ago. And you can update that footage you shot 5, 6, 7 years ago, no problem. And I think that flexibility is what's fascinating. But the other thing I want to touch on is, obviously, Blackmagic does a lot of those things. Now, if you were to strip the brand names off it, what would you say is the real difference in the image between, say, the Pocket 6K and the Komodo?
So between the Pocket and the Komodo, I would say is clarity. I would say the Red looks crisper, and there's just it tends, I think, to lean towards green a little bit, whereas I think the Blackmagic sensors lean a bit more towards magenta. But again, that's not a big thing. I think that realistically, these cameras are just getting so close together, and blind tests, are gonna just, look at MKHD when he does his phone camera tests. People aren't picking brands, they're leaning towards the image in that specific scenario and what works. If I was, if people are out there and they're thinking, what camera should I buy? You got to factor in everything. You got to factor in your budget. I would never say buy a camera based on brand alone. I would always recommend buy a camera based on how you work and how that camera is going to make your job easier. Don't just buy a camera because of brand names. I mean, you can, and it may well work for you, but I think these days you got to just think how you work as a person. We all think about the jobs you're doing, and is that camera going to benefit your work? Is it going to help you to step up your work? And if it is, and if it ticks enough boxes, then you go for that. And it shouldn't make a difference what the brand is. You are going to get amazing images out of Blackmagic cameras. You're going to get amazing images out of Sony, Canon, Red, Alexa, all of them. If you know what you're doing, you light, you frame well, your footage is going to look amazing. Because that's where we're at right now when it comes to cameras. You can set up a DSLR, mirrorless Sony camera, and it will look stunning. And, that's just where technology has come. So really, the things you should be thinking about when you're choosing your next camera are just, how is it going to benefit you? How is it going to make your job easier? And is it going to let you step it up a little bit over what you've been doing previously? And that doesn't mean it's necessarily a better camera. Maybe it's just going to motivate you. Maybe you're going to get excited again, because that's what tech does, right? It gets you excited about working. And, I'd used Blackmagic for years. very excitable time, shot some of the best footage I've ever shot, and now I'm excited to use the Komodo. It's just the next part. It doesn't mean it's the end of the journey. It's just the next step. And, you know, chances are we're probably going to be going between all of these cameras over the next like 10, 15 years anyway, because they're all just stepping it up. So yeah, it's just what's right for you. And only you can really decide that.
Yeah. You know, I think the thing that really to focus on, you know, in closing here, honestly, guys, your camera is your paintbrush. It's your tool. It can't get in your way. If it gets in the way, it's not the right camera for you. You can try and buy cameras to chase a certain type of work. But if that's not the work you're doing and it's not suiting the way your style is, then don't force it. You could be compromising your style just to get a certain camera. That's ridiculous. It has to feel like an extension of your creative self, you know? And, you know, you know, Mark's been very clear about why he's chose that camera, why it benefited him. Obviously, there's a great brand name, but it's a tool that's going to be useful for him and allow him to get what he needs to get image-wise and quality-wise for his clients, his films. So you have to always take that into account when you're making your decision. Don't just go after what YouTubers, we're going to be YouTubers now. Don't go after what other YouTubers say. They're sponsored by CVP and BHP to get B&H, sorry, to buy certain cameras. But like, you know, you really have to take that kind of measured decision, you know, because again, if you chase it, you're chasing it, you're going to constantly be trying to play catch up with this film industry. And really, it's got to suit your art form. So guys, we're going to close it there today. You know, Thank you for listening to us. That was episode 3 of Help, I'm a Camera Nerd podcast. Remember to like and subscribe. You can find us on Spotify, if you're probably listening to it, and the other podcasting platforms, or, you know, on our YouTube channels. And, you know, we're going to be uploading, taking turns of each week where, you know, for instance, this is on Mark's channel on Help, I'm a Nerd. And the next episode will be on my channel, Films by AW. So thanks for joining, guys. Have a great time. See you on the other side.